Oh, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to whatever month this is Ember.js. It's November.js meetup. Sorry, I'm a little punch drunk. The core team had our quarterly face-to-face meeting this past weekend, and it was 2 rather intense days of talking to nerds. One of whom I've brought along with me. I just found him stray on the street, and look what followed me to work. So anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you to Groupon for providing the space for us, and then also the delicious Mediterranean food. If you have questions about Groupon, I'm also an employee, as is Sean. We work on the same team. We're on the user interface engineering team, so tight usage of Ember where we care about interfaces. Trying to think what other cool stuff's gone on in the Ember world since last we met. Is anyone new here? Anyone who's not been here before? Oh wow, many new faces. Did you come just to see Alex? Yeah. The shy one, a little bit. Very cool. So we had the face-to-face this weekend. There's an extremely long document on our RFC repo if you want to go read about what's coming in Ember 2.0. If you've read about what's coming in Angular 2.0, it is much less than that in terms of horrible, painful upgrades. We have a pretty good migration plan in place, so we're always looking for feedback on that. So anyway, without further ado, Alex, aka King Router, King Router. He's been upgraded from just Mr. to King. Is going to give us a talk about some of the stuff that he's been doing. I think we're going to get a demo of some of his product. Woo! And then a talk about doing mobile web apps with Ember.js. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to Trek and Groupon for having me out. It's been probably a year and a half since I was last at a Groupon-ish or a Chicago Ember-related thing. I guess it was somewhere else last time. But that was when I firmly implanted into the psyche that Ember was the foremost framework for jorts, developers and jorts. So I'm trying to keep it a little more formal this time. So my name is Alex. Today I'm going to be presenting on basically how you can use Ember to write mobile apps, usually in a Cordova setting for anyone who's got some experience in that. It's something that I've got a lot of recent experience in because for the last year or so I've been building a product called Express Checkout, which is basically lets you go into a store, scan items on your phone, and pay on your phone, and ideally walk out with no interaction with a line or any of these old school ways of getting in and out. And so that's an Ember app that's embedded in the Cordova framework, which basically lets you write web apps and embed them in iOS, Android, Windows, whatever you want to do. So we'll be launching probably in a week, maybe a little bit longer than that, depending on some stuff. But I'm very excited to finally have that done. But this talk is going to be about a lot of the various things that I've sort of learned and how Ember sort of fits into the mobile web app world. Also, for what it's worth, at any point, if I'm saying something that you would like some further clarification on, or if it comes out all mumbly, feel free to just interrupt me or raise hands or whatever you want to do, and I'm happy to sort of keep this as interactive as possible. So today I'll be talking about what hybrid mobile apps are and kind of why you'd make the choice to use them and how they sort of work and what the workflow is when you're building these things. We'll be talking about Cordova, which is sort of the framework of choice for the most part if you're going to be trying to embed a web app into a native mobile app. I'll be talking about how the normal patterns for Ember app architecture sort of change and modify when you're going to be doing something mobile and what assumptions sort of change. I'll be talking about a pretty new, as of the last like 3 months or so, library that's come out called Liquid Fire. That basically allows for some cool transitions, the normal sort of sideways and pretty much anything you could try to do, transitions, and how that sort of made writing Ember apps that are more interactive and native feeling way more possible. It's definitely something I've made use of. I'll be talking about Ember CLI, which is sort of, if you're going to be starting an Ember app today, hopefully you're using it. And just go over some things that I've learned in the process that don't have a maybe very pretty picture. But so hybrid mobile apps, what does this actually mean? Hybrid basically means you're combining the native of iOS and Android with web technology. And really it means that you've got some variant of a browser in a native app that you're running that is inside this browser running your web app code. So using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS and all the web tech that hopefully y'all are familiar with. So one of the benefits of this is that if you've put a majority of the code into your HTML and HTML and JavaScript, then that's that much less code that you would have to write for every different platform that you're trying to target. If you want to build an app and you want to deploy to both the App Store, the Apple App Store, and Android, you would have to, if you weren't using any of this sort of web tech, you would have to basically rewrite your app twice, once in Objective-C and once in Java. And I don't know very many people who single-handedly do a good job of that without a whole lot of other investment or multiple developers. So really, if you're going to be going down this route, it's ideal to basically put as much logic into your JavaScript as possible so that you have to barely write any Objective-C or Java at all. So what's good about all this is obviously you can deploy to a bunch of different platforms on the same code base. And also a lot of this stuff, a lot of the tools you use are going to be familiar to what you would use if you were just building an interactive web app on the desktop. Also, of course, if you like Ember, you can use Ember, and that's obviously a plus. The bad part about kind of deciding to take the hybrid mobile app approach is that it's pretty difficult to actually make it feel and have the performance and the responsiveness of a truly native app, because iOS is putting a lot of polish into every single little transition, and as you slowly drag this button from here to there, you'll see something in the background just delicately changing opacity and whatnot. It's very hard to get all that same stuff to look and feel the same way as it would if you were just doing everything in Objective-C. And browsers, there's already a lot of different quirks between them, even on modern browsers, and it gets worse in a mobile context where all the rules just suddenly seem to change, and there's things that are specific to this version of the Android browser on this platform and whatnot, and it's pretty difficult to keep that bottled up. I think in the end, some of the stuff I'll present on will make things a little more manageable, but and anytime that you try to sort of get beyond what the web tech can do for you, it means you're probably going to be digging into some of the native code, the Java and the Objective-C. So if you need to do anything that's sort of outside of normal brain. So that's sort of the trade-off to be aware of. So fortunately, there's a framework that used to be called Phonegap and now is managed by Apache as an open source framework under the name Cordova, which is basically, this is what you use to write all of your code, or majority of your code, in JavaScript, and then be able to call out to the native wrapper, the Java or the Objective-C, to do fancy things like display a camera, or all these things that don't really have, that you can't really do just in the web alone. So if you wanted to record a video, you wanted to take a photo, if you wanted to have like fine-grained control over the accelerometer, chances are you're probably going to have to call into the native code. And so basically Cordova, basically for all the different browsers and all the different platforms, this gives you this unified JavaScript API to make these queries in and out of your native mobile wrapper. So definitely use it. If you had to do any of this stuff on your own, it would mean like crazy hacks like sending your request to the listening native wrapper by setting the location of some like hidden iframe to a different URL that gets intercepted. It's horrible stuff that you should hopefully never have to think about, but that's pretty much all the horrible stuff that Cordova uses. And pretty much everybody who's doing a hybrid mobile app that I've ever talked to uses it. So it's very well adopted, and if you're going down this path, definitely have no hesitation about using Cordova. So like I said, it's basically the bridge between the native and JavaScript layers, and it's, for any command that you could issue, it sort of has a standard format of, passing the data that in as, say, JSON, and then basically you pass it in a success and failure handler. And if any of you have done promises before, it's sort of very easy to wrap a lot of that interface behind that. So basically, if you just download Cordova and just maybe get the iOS version running in Xcode or whatnot, it's the only contract that you have to adhere to is basically take all of this compiled Ember code or index.html and all these assets and put it into the www directory in a Cordova project. And if you just build it, you should basically see your app inside a native mobile app and just can basically go from there and make it more and more native-y feeling. It's unusual if you're coming from a desktop background, but it's pretty easy to get up and running. So before sort of going into the specifics of sort of Ember architecture and where Ember fits into this, I want to just give you a sort of quick overview of the thing I've been working on so that all these concepts can sort of make sense. Promise this is relevant and not just self-aggrandizing. But, also you can set it like a 20-second timer, because if getting this to show up on the screen takes any longer than that, we can just move on. But seems like it's going to work. So this here is an Ember app in the background. This is going to be the store, the Stagastino store. It doesn't actually look like that. It's supposed to be a video display. So basically, this should ideally look and feel like just an iOS app with maybe a little bit of custom UI going for it. It doesn't really fall into the typical iOS scheme. But all this code that's running is JavaScript. It's an Ember app. The header and everything that you see there, the buttons are just something that's for like developer mode, so I don't have to like find the barcode to scan every single time. But the idea is that every time that you scan something, you will kind of look up the store's database and find all this stuff, and then all you want, and then just be able to pay on your phone after checking out. So obviously, this camera isn't something that you can just do in pure HTML, pure JavaScript. That's one of the things that you've got to tell through this Cordova wrapper, to tell the native Objective-C or Java code to put up a camera view behind this transparent web view that your web app lives in. And anytime that there's a new scan that comes in, you should. Anytime that there's a new scan that comes in, that needs to be relayed back to your JavaScript app. Oops, that's not what I want to do. Hold on, I think just need to redo the Wi-Fi. Yeah, so basically any sort of this communication that needs to happen is going to be provided by Cordova. Cordova makes it actually pretty easy to do this kind of stuff. So that's enough about Cordova. I don't really want to go too into all the API specifics about it. This is, after all, an Ember presentation. So Ember, who here has never used Ember before? Trek? Anybody else? Okay, so if you're already aware of this, just glaze over for a little bit, but it's basically relative to a lot of the other frameworks that you might use for putting together a web app. Ember is the most opinionated. It tries to be very convention over configuration and try to basically amass a bunch of patterns that hopefully you don't sort of reinvent the wheel every time that you build a web app. So it's kind of like Rails in that way. Comes with a lot of opinions and kind of tells you how to put things together, and sort of makes you feel pain if you're doing something unnecessarily evil or off the beaten path for no good reason. And I think what's maybe it's old news at this point, but what's sort of most unique about when you're going to build an Ember app is that the first thing it makes you think about is all the routes that are in your application. And a route is basically a mapping from your URL to a different state that your app could be in. So ideally, as you're clicking buttons and moving around your app or going to different pages, or even in a mobile app, if pages are swiping left and right, you're winding up at some page or some state in your app that's kind of serialized into the URL, so that you should just be able to grab that URL, send it to some friends, and they would be able to open that and see the same thing. And that's basically the first thing that Ember makes you think about, because it's also very hard to get right on your own if you try to sort of get your app working and then throw URLs in at the last second. So the Ember router, which is a lot of the thing that I work on, it solves a lot of different problems. So how do you keep your application state in sync with the URL without breaking the back button, which is also surprisingly hard to get right, considering GitHub still doesn't really get that right, and if you've gone to their issues and other places. And also, how do you handle things like data taking a really long time to load? And another thing is, how do you basically arbitrarily have these deeply nested views. Usually you'll have some shared header, and then you go to one page, and then you need to replace an inner portion of that. And if you don't have sort of proper support for that, it's kind of a tricky thing to build on your own, or can be, particularly if you have to keep all these other problems and other constraints in mind. So that's why the Ember router does what it does. That's why it's so opinionated, and that's why Ember sort of makes you think about this stuff first. It's really hard. So that being said, is it still something that you care about? Is it like, are the conventions for starting router first, does this actually apply to mobile apps? So for instance, do you care about URLs? Is that a concept anyone cares about? You don't really see a browser address bar in a native app. Nor do you really have a whole lot of nested views happening. Usually it's going to be one page at a time, rendering everything relevant to that page, and then you go to the next page, you'll probably swipe over to the left, and it's a totally different thing. There's no concept of nesting. So is it really still an important pattern to sort of think router first, as Ember always tries to make you do? So I think one thing to keep in mind for URLs is that the end user might not ever see anything about a URL, but as you're developing this thing and you want to be able to make a change and then have your live reload just quickly refresh and display exactly what you were just looking at, but with your changes, it's really nice to have a URL that handles that state problem, reconstruction problem for you, rather than having to write some code yourself. And if you sort of stay on the normal Ember beaten path for having a route for every different state that your app can be in, this just makes a lot of the development a lot simpler, and you have to do a lot less hacks and to sort of prevent yourself from having to refresh the page and then click 17 buttons to get looking at what you were looking at before you made the code change. So yeah, most of your development, for what it's worth, is actually going to take place in just a normal Chrome browser. There's good emulation at this point for it to pretend and have the size of a mobile platform, but all of your development is going to be taking place in the browser, which does have URLs. So do yourself a favor and keep using those, because otherwise you're going to be just needlessly wasting a lot of time as you're working on this app. Yeah.
So sounds like you're saying that even though you don't see the address bar on the native app with Cordova, is running these URLs using.
Yeah, I mean, because basically Cordova, regardless of iOS or Android, is going to be putting your HTML and JavaScript code in what's called a web view, which is kind of like a mini browser just embedded in there. And internally, it does have a URL. You could write the JavaScript code to print out what the window.location is and whatnot, and all the ways that internally it is maintaining that, even if it never displays it.
Do you get runtime errors or some kind of compiled time assistance with that if you try to deploy to a web view that doesn't have an API that you're assuming?
You mean
Cordova like hide that? Like, do you say which platform range you're intending to target, like 2.1 or whatever, or do you just say give me an Android build and?
What's the kind of API that would be missing?
Just like a browser API, like if it's a web view that's, like the ancient Android phones, for instance, use very old web views, right, that aren't going to have.
I don't know off the top of my head what the cutoff was. As far as I know, the support goes back pretty far. It's just the further back it goes, the crazier stuff you got to do to, facilitate that bridge.
Yeah. When you're developing in Chrome and you say have like the camera feature as a portion of your app, you're just seeing transparent space when you're doing that development, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have some kind of emulator.
I talk about that a little bit later, sort of what you do to fill in the gap of not having a live camera. So yeah, URLs still mean anything. There's also another use case for them, which is that there are times when you might actually have a meaningful URL that you would like to, say, redirect back into if you have a password reset page where that requires you to go to iOS Safari. So if you forgot your password, you tell it to send you a reset password, you go to your email, that gives you a reset password link, which maybe could go directly to your app, but most likely it's just going to be some iOS Safari page. And then you go through that process, you reset your password, then you'd like to just be able to press a button that takes you back into the app. Well, the way you can do that is that for both Android and iOS and probably other ones, you can actually associate your app with a custom scheme. Instead of HTTP or HTTPS, you can say my dumb app or Express Checker or something more professional. And that's associated with your app. So if you try to navigate to it, it will spin up your app and provide that the path, like sign in to your app, and your app can sort of interpret that and make sure that you land somewhere more sensible than just the home screen. So there's other use cases for URLs. So if you have that already in your app, you kind of get that for free. So what about nested views? That's sort of the other thing that Ember gives you for desktop apps that maybe you don't really care about for mobile apps. And for what it's worth, you are probably not going to use nested views. So I guess in that case, consider it a complexity that you normally have to deal with that you don't have to think too much about in mobile Ember land. So I'll sort of show you what you do instead in just a moment. So that being said, with this sort of basic overview, how do you actually, what changes between making a desktop Ember app and a mobile Ember app? Sounds like maybe you'd have to override a lot of defaults if, to facilitate something that's so drastically different than the desktop environment. And actually, it's not that bad what you have to do. So again, remember that there's no deep nesting of views that you normally have in a desktop environment. And every time that you have a different state or a route, a route is just a state that's mapped to a URL, and it's probably re-rendering everything on the screen. There's no nesting. And one of the things that Ember provides is that you can define a route hierarchy that kind of combines a few different things. It combines, by default, a default view nesting, but also a data hierarchy. So for instance, you might have a top-level route that is the list of articles, and then drill down one nesting deeper, and then there's a detail route for displaying a single article, and then that might have a comments route, and then you might drill into a single comment. And all along the way, those routes sort of can ask their ancestors what they are so that they can perform their own data loading. The comments page needs to know what article is currently loaded to know what to load off the server. So you want to preserve that. It's very useful to have, but you still don't want the things like nested views and whatnot. So these are sort of the constraints to keep in mind. So if you were to think about how you would, sort of a case study, I guess, of how the web app for Twitter looks, if we were to try to implement a tweets page, which shows you a list of tweets, and then you wanted to say, click on this Unity post and go down to the detail view, and then tap on the retweets button, which is actually out of this view, and see a list of everybody that's retweeted this. How would you sort of represent that in Ember router architecture? So another way to think about it is you have the tweets, and then nested inside of that is the tweet detail page, and then nested in that is a list of retweeters. And if you were to think about what URLs those have, if you've decided to adhere to those as you should, it probably looks something like you're slowly building up this tweet/123/retweets. So for anyone that's written some Ember code before, this should seem pretty familiar. There's nothing in here that is off the beaten path. You've given a name to each of these routes. You have nested them to sort of imply the data hierarchy and view nesting hierarchy if you care about that sort of thing, but we don't in this case. And you say that the tweet has a ID, a dynamic ID, which gets serialized into the URL, such as tweets 123 would be the 123 is the ID of a single tweet that you're looking at, but it could change. So nothing special about this. There's nothing here that seems mobile specific. So what about view nesting? How do you prevent that? I mean, by default, every one of these routes that you might define, or these templates that you would define for tweets or tweet or retweets, might have a outlet that you put in there, which is basically a hole with which you can fill in with the content of a child route, of a nested child route. But we don't care about that because, again, every single route that you go to is going to be displaying an entirely different page. There's nothing in here that is nested in here. I mean, I guess this is like sort of a truncated, smaller version of this text, but it's not like this is actually, there's no nesting that takes place. It's this page, or this page, or this page being displayed. So it's, at some point, you've got to break that default that Ember provides you. And how do you do that? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that you can't really nest views if you don't provide any outlets for them to nest into. This is not a beautiful slide, but I'll sort of say what I'm trying to convey there. Basically, if you have the tweets, the list of tweets, you're probably going to have this each looping over every single tweet that's been provided or loaded from Ajax or whatnot. And then if you have the individual detail is probably, it's already, the model for that route is going to be a single tweet, and then you could be displaying information about the name or whatnot. But what's sort of common in each of these things is that none of these templates has an outlet that you could render into, because at no point are you going to be rendering these nested views. So the only one that's going to have an outlet is this sort of top-level application template, which is, if you're running an Ember app, is always being displayed at the screen. It's just everything that's inside of it that kind of changes around as you navigate around the app. So if anyone here has tried to do something like this before, you might be wondering, if you're in this retweets route, wouldn't that mean that all these templates are active at the same time? Like, how do you decide which of these are going to be displaying? Because usually they're going to be doing some kind of nesting. So this is where the sort of trick that makes all this stuff very simple comes in. And basically you have to make use of something that is called an index route. So I guess going back to this example here, actually it's on the next slide. This example of this router.map function, which you use to sketch out all the different states of your app, aside from the tweets route and the tweet route and the retweets route, there's also going to be these implicit index routes that are created for you. Does this ring a bell? Has anyone run into index routes before? Has it ever been a surprise that it existed?
I didn't know what it was.
What's that?
I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, it's maybe something that we could be a little more straight to the point about, but it's a surprise. What's that?
Get rid of it.
Trek wants to get rid of it. I don't. But sort of what it allows is basically, there's one rule about the Ember router. Well, there are many rules about the one router, but the one that makes my point in a very eloquent manner is that you can never transition into a route that isn't a leaf. So for instance, you can't just transition into tweet, because tweet has a child route called retweets. Anytime that you would say link to tweet and then click on that link, you're going to wind up in this implicit index route, which is generated for you, tweet.index. And as much as that might be a surprising thing that Trek might want to get rid of, this is the thing that actually makes this pattern that gets rid of nesting and whatnot pretty easy and workable. So for instance, rather than just, say, making a tweets.handlebars or a tweet.handlebars or retweets.handlebars, you can make use of these implicit indexes that get generated for you. And I guess this sort of way to, what this does is this sort of answers the question of like, how can I be in the tweet route without displaying the template associated with tweets? It's like, well, the template associated with tweets is actually tweets.index. You can't be in tweets.index at the same time that you're in this, tweets.tweet route. You've sort of left the index route in order to display whatever is in the tweet route. So I am going to just guess that this might not make a whole lot of sense. This is probably something to just think about later if you're kind of going down this route. So I kind of want to skip over just talking about it and sort of get to a JS bin, which will do probably a better job of explaining how this all works. But basically what this means is that there's no like configuration. You don't have to change some configuration object in all of your routes to sort of go off the beaten path and render a different kind of template than you would by default in a desktop app. It's just if you are using, for instance, Ember CLI, which is a module-based approach to building Ember apps, you just have to put the template in the right place, and you get this for free, and you sort of get used to that pattern very quickly. So, like I said, you can only transition to a leaf route, and this is sort of the pattern that we take advantage of in order to basically map the normal Ember approach to building your app from a router-first way and get it to fit into what makes sense for mobile. So there's also some other conveniences, which is that one of the first things that you have to implement when you're going to be writing a route is you have to implement this model hook, which is basically how do I take this URL, such as tweet/123, and actually perform the AJAX request or the Ember data load that will load the tweet with ID 123 from the server. And, well, turns out that you don't have to explicitly define all these model hooks. There's lots of little conveniences, such as reusing the data of your parent route and whatnot. All this stuff is honestly just a minimal amount of code is the point of this slide. So probably makes sense to look at a JS bin. So I made a similar presentation in Austin last week. So you're going to be seeing queries against the Meetup API that are Ember, Austin, ATX specific, so bear with me. But to give you a quick little overview, here's a very basic app where you can click and sort of drill down. It's not tweets and tweet and retweets, it's actually meetups, meetup detail, and attendees. So it's the same sort of hierarchy, but actually hitting live queries on the server. So this is kind of set up. Let me know if I need to make the text bigger. I think it should be pretty decently readable at this point. But this is sort of set up with CSS that should be sort of in your typical mobile app setup. This should actually look a lot like the Twitter mobile app, where you've had these different sections of the site at the bottom. And that was actually an intentional error. But yeah, so this is bare bones. I'll be posting a link to these slides later if you guys also want to toy around with this JS bin. But if you want to take a look at what sort of code went into this thing, it's not a whole lot, and it's also very idiomatic from an Ember standpoint. So for instance, we've got the same old router.map function, which every Ember app has. Much like the tweets, retweets, this is a very similar nesting structure to it. And nothing here is kind of out of the ordinary. I'll tell you about what this whole thing is later. But we just display some links in the application controller. I've got a hacky little AJAX-only approach for querying the server and then caching the result. It's nothing really relevant to the example. But all this stuff, bear with me if you've never looked at Ember code before, but the point of all of this is that it's all idiomatic stuff. There's nothing crazy that's happened, and it's just because we've named the templates properly to use these index. I believe I've lost my cursor. Oh, there it is. Because you've named your templates correctly, that's the only configuration detail that makes all this stuff work. And I'll just show you real quick what these, I'm kind of using the JS bin version where you've got to wrap everything in script tags, but in Ember CLI or Ember AppKit, if anyone's still using that, which takes a more mobile approach, it's just a matter of naming your templates and putting them in the right folder rather than putting this data template name here. So it's really nothing fancy. You're just looping over stuff, making lists of whatnot. And again, the only rule is that you only have one outlet, and that is an outlet that is up here. And this liquid outlet is jumping ahead to when I start talking about the animation approach, but you could just write outlet and it would do the same thing. So again, nothing's really gone off the deep end as far as facilitating something which actually looks like a pretty standard mobile setup. But that being said, that's super boring because you're still working on something that is clearly very static. Every time you click a link, the whole page just refreshes. There's no idea of transitions, things moving around, and all these things that just feel like a native mobile app. So what can you do about that? Enter this library called Liquid Fire, which is made by Edward Faulkner, who's not a member of the core team member, but might as well be because everything about this library is very high quality and very well integrated into Ember, and really couldn't have done a better job. So it's definitely my favorite non-core team initiated Ember library. It's just something that he dropped out of the sky maybe 3 months ago, and it's great. You can use it for very many things, from these very full-on route transition animations or a value has changed, so you want to have a sort of counter animation, and it's very cool. It's very flexible. So it uses, like, internally it uses a animation library called Velocity.js, which basically is nice because Ember doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, and Velocity.js does lots of nice things. Like, it's not going to try and look up a CSS property and cause an invalidation of or relayout or any of these other things that can kind of slow down everything. It's just kind of does lots of intelligent stuff for you that, you know, Liquid Fire doesn't really try to improve on. It just uses it, and it's sort of, you can see from its API that that's sort of what it's based off of. So probably worth just taking a quick look, because if any of you, whether you're doing mobile apps or not, it's definitely worth taking a look at the Liquid Fire site. This site is actually, it's a document site, but it's actually using the same repo that the code lives in, because it's using an Ember CLI add-on and whatnot, and you can do all sorts of crazy stuff with that. But I guess it's kind of cool just to look through some of these examples that all have live things. So as you change values, you can provide it enough information to decide, like, the directionality of an animation and, like, what the inverse of an animation is, and you can customize it and add different animation types, such that rather than just some fading thing or a sliding thing, you can rotate. And it's just very flexible, and it's really cool. Like some of these, you know, any time that you have a cool toy like an animation library, it's easy to just, like, completely overdo it, which everyone should probably do as part of a learning experience. But it's also just fine-grained control, and you can do some really, really powerful things. So I definitely use it in my mobile apps. I use it in other apps as well. But it's definitely kind of helped to form a basis of a really clean and neat way that you can do, you know, typical mobile transitions in Ember apps.
What's sort of Ember-y about that library?
What's Ember-y is that it knows things like, oh, you've transitioned from here, from route A to route B, and it's going to look at a transition map that you've defined to decide based on that route transition what animations should take place. So it's been heavily integrated into knowing what route you're currently in, and all of them also, just like, a lot of them just look like helpers that exist today. So there's a with helper, and then there's a liquid there's a with helper, and there's a liquid with helper, and then there's an if helper, and there's a liquid if, and it looks and feels very Ember-y without feeling like something's kind of rudely interrupted the normal Ember flow of things. And it's also just very tightly integrated to make lots of this stuff pretty effortless.
Cool. So it has like a programmatic API also?
Yeah, I'll show you what that actually looks like. It's pretty cool when you need to sort of kind of get your hands dirty. So that's very cool, but how does that actually plug into something that's going to be a mobile Ember app? So coming back to the JS bin that we were looking at before with this sort of meetup API, I kind of left some code commented out, which makes it actually pretty easy once I uncommented it to see some cool transitions. So before iOS 7, all the transitions from iOS 6 and earlier were just straight up, you got two views glued together, and then one pushes the other out as you sort of drill down from like a master detail view. So I'm just going to make this change to this Liquid Fire map function, which is kind of a little analogous to the router.map, but it's rather than sketching out all the different app states you can be in, this is sort of how you map transitions between different routes and basically decide what kind of animations should happen. So for instance, I've made this custom sideways function which wraps this Liquid Fire transition API, and it should be very easy to see what this is saying. So I basically am saying between the events route and the event route, and between the event and person route, I want there to be this sideways transition. It should be pretty easy to look at the code and sort of see what's going on here. But this is how you teach Liquid Fire how to make these kinds of transitions between things. And they can drill down and look at some attendee. And suddenly what used to just be a full like instantaneous flash refresh, which is not very friendly in idiomatic mobile, is now just without any other change other than adding this liquid fire map function, it all just immediately works. And on top of that, this happens to be just one kind of transition that you could do. I defined another more kind of complicated transition called overlap, which from iOS 7 and onward, you'll maybe notice if you care about these sort of things that you're going to be drilling down into a detail view. It isn't just two views glued to each other, one pushing out the other. It's like the one kind of leaving the screen is going slightly slower while the one coming on comes on faster. So there's sort of this overlappy effect, and you can see the background also gets darker. I'll actually just show you what this looks like, but it's not hard to just swap out the transition styles, and then you get something that looks kind of like iOS 7. You can see all these different things that are happening. It's like the new view is moving in faster than the old view. You see this like darkening effect, and you can actually, I think, how do I do this? It's probably a way that you can just slow it down. Just make it really slow and exaggerated, but you can sort of just see all the stuff that's happening. And yet, all that you've really done is put in an outlet and replace the name of the outlet with the liquid outlet to kind of bring in the liquid fire library and have it manage your transitions versus the default Ember outlet. And if you want to actually see what this is, I think this is sort of what you were asking about, but how do you actually do procedural transitions? It's like you're still going to be defining a transition type, and then you're actually at a really low level manipulating views or adding a transition overlay view. Like all this code is actually pretty jank, but it's like very encapsulated jank that you never have to think about once you've gotten it right. Because once you get that right, suddenly all the API is just constrained to these like transition maps that basically decide, given a transition, if it falls in these predefined routes, these liquid fire mapped transitions, it'll basically decide which directions it's going to go, which kind of transition it's going to be. It's really cool, and it saves you a lot of code, and all of it still ends up seeming has that nice like Ember API sheen to it.
What route are you in?
Right now I'm in events.
No, while it's happening.
Oh, you are in the new route, for what it's worth.
Right.
Yeah, it's just the outward view is just a relic of a thing that you've already left.
And what if there's a promise hook on one of those route transitions? How does that work?
So you the loading substate stuff that Ember has is also just a route. So you could make a loading template and then define a map between other routes and the loading route, and it'll transition there. Maybe you'll have a different transition into a loading route than you would for like an immediately resolving thing.
So this stuff that you have here is some of the time that stuff not even necessary to define? Is that like when you want to customize your tweening function that you have to do that? I mean, how much comes out of the box?
Well, a lot. I mean, the bare bones stuff, the like slide left, slide right, slide up, slide down, that stuff's already in there. Maybe some other ones I'm not thinking of. And I think I fixed this in a later JS bin, but forgot to save it. But the fact that I'm hardwiring this duration into the transition itself is pretty bad. The proper way to do it, and it's totally supported if I just make a quick change, is to accept some configuration parameters that I think get passed in that you could probably do in the this.transition thing. You can configure all that stuff and ideally keep those configuration stuff out of the transition itself. Is this all making sense? Any other questions before kind of go on? Again, I'll post all this stuff. It's a pretty fun JS bin to toy around with. So, case in point, Liquid Fire is pretty awesome, and it's not just a toy that you can overuse and make ugly over transitioning websites. It's I use it in 2 of the apps that make up my product, and I'll definitely continue to use it. It's very cool. It's very powerful. So that's sort of the main important stuff to know, the stuff that actually makes a mobile Ember app actually start to feel like a native app. but some other patterns that sort of kind of come into play. It's probably not too hard to figure out how you could do this, but Ember by default is always going to render into a single outlet every time that you transition into a route. But if you wanted to control things like how does the header, how does the title that's of the current page, how does it shift to the left and turn into the arrow, like all these things that are very hyper-specific to whatever platform. All that stuff can be pretty easily handled just by rendering into additional outlets and then configuring how those transitions work with Liquid Fire. It's actually, once you've sort of wrapped your head around the JS bin that I just posted, it's pretty easy to figure out that stuff.
Who's the author of Liquid Fire?
Edward Faulkner?
Is he involved with the Ember core team?
No, he's not on the core team, but he might as well be. You probably asked him. I don't even know if this page is worth talking about, but there's other things that you could do that are. So, for instance, you could choose to build your app in such a way that like every drill down page that you do is a sub route of another one. In which case, it would be very convenient to know. And Ember doesn't give this to you by default. What by default should happen when you click the back button. So there are other ways that you could take the normal router.map function, have that sort of load information into another data structure that you can export. That sounds really over the top. I think I should probably just add that to Ember versus trying to explain it in a slide. But there's other little things that I think other people that I've talked to about this stuff have done. So I mentioned Ember CLI a few times. Who here has experience with Ember CLI? Okay, so that's good. It should hopefully be taking over because it sort of has the official stamp of approval from the Ember core team, because Ember is trying to be a lot more than just a web app framework. It's trying to, as much as it's trying to do convention over configuration and just the JavaScript API, it's trying to do it beyond that in the way that all these different libraries are packaged together, so you don't have to do all of your own build tools. So it's very fast at this point. I think for a while it hobbled, and then in the last 2 months it's just been ridiculously, blazingly fast. There's a pretty rich plugin ecosystem of Ember add-ons, which are very easy to add into your app. Liquid Fire is one of them. You literally just have to do npm install Liquid Fire and save it into your package JSON, and it will. You just suddenly have all those liquid outlet helpers and whatnot available to your app. I haven't really given this one a shot yet. I want to actually get behind it and make sure it's very high quality, and I want to use it for my own projects. But there's an example of sort of how far you can go with this add-ons approach is that someone has gone ahead and created Ember CLI Cordova, which like currently my development flow is like a little manual, and I still have to build this and that and copy these files over. And some of these things are automated, but to have something that's actually like part of the Ember workflow and minimize the stuff that I have to do, and hopefully minimize the amount of the learning curve when you start writing this stuff. If you can encapsulate that in an Ember add-on, which just makes everything sort of feel like the conventional Ember world, it would be really nice. And this definitely seems to be gaining some steam. So I definitely take a look at that if you are starting an Ember Cordova app for the first time. Can't put the stamp of approval on it quite yet, but it is promising. So, as I said, what's the point of Ember CLI is basically when Rails came out, it immediately introduced you to its command line interface and didn't just call it Rails CLI as a separate thing from the normal Rails framework. It's just part of the whole package. If you're going to make a Rails app, you have to know these things, and you should use these things, and you should use generators, and you should use all these rake commands that come with it. And that's sort of where Ember CLI is going. There should be sort of single way of developing these apps, even when it comes to the CLI, that can also tap into the ecosystem and hopefully just solidify around a few patterns, so that not everyone's just building, packaging all of their code in totally different ways and not being able to learn from each other. So yeah, again, it's basically bringing convention configuration beyond just the JavaScript. So some other things that I've learned in the process of making this stuff that don't really have like a pretty bow on it, just that HTML and CSS are not actually my forte. I can do it if I have to, but it eats up a lot of time, and I always get it wrong, and I forget which browsers have these little gotchas, and it gets way worse when you start going into the mobile world. So I would recommend, if you've got the means, to hire somebody who actually really likes this stuff, and that is going to do all the static stuff for you, so that all you got to do is take these things and Emberize it, which is the easy and fun part. I would highly recommend that, because regardless of what framework you're going to do, it's very much a pain in the ass to do pretty high quality HTML and CSS if you're going to be doing mobile stuff in particular. Also, forms always just kind of suck, and they get way worse, like everything else tends to do when you start getting into a mobile setting. And there's all these like rules about it. You try to focus a field on a set timeout when it wasn't initiated by a user interaction. It'll sort of half work. It might focus, but the keyboard doesn't come up, and all these other horrible little things. There's only so much. That isn't even really an Ember-specific thing. It's just what happens when you go into the mobile world. And these things just get quirky and weird and difficult. And there's some Cordova plugins that can help, but for the most part, it's always just going to kind of suck. So keep that in mind. It will probably be a little bit of a slog if you haven't done any of this stuff before. But that's pretty much all I got to present on today. Is there any other questions? Good.
Can you just like tell a little bit about Ember CLI? Like what actually does it do?
So the first thing,
and is it built around NPM or something? Because it sounded like you NPM installed or something. So
yeah, it uses NPM and Bower.
It does.
All the add-ons are going to be NPM packages. But I mean, so what does it do? The first thing you do with Ember CLI after you install it is create a new app, and that's going to give you kind of like Rails new foo would do. If you do Ember new foo, it's going to create you a new Ember app and Git repo and all these things in the foo directory, and everything just sort of set up and ready to go, and the defaults for test them, and a bunch of other things and some sample code. And then after that point, like if you're ready to start using LiquidFire, you can just say npm install LiquidFire save dev, and now you have it just built into your app, such that it'll be automatically packaged the correct way. All those helpers that you can use from LiquidFire are exposed and ready to be used. And so it's really just from creating an app, maintaining it, building it, adding different add-ons. It's all of that.
If you wanted to migrate to use it, would that be valuable if you had a pre-existing app, or like? Yeah,
definitely. I think most people are at this point. I think it's of all the things, like particularly like today, we've just posted an RFC about the sort of road to Ember 2.0 and what that's going to look like, and all that part is going to be the easy part. I think the hardest part might be just like if you're in old globals Ember mode where you're stashing everything as classes on your app instance. That'll be like a little bit of a slog to get things, depending on the size of your app, into the module format that Ember CLI requires. But that's probably about it. I think most people got through that pretty quickly, except for some of the larger, huge Ember apps.
If anybody's maintaining an app, though, like it's probably in their best interest to do this.
Yeah.
Essentially. Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that gives you this really nice is it allows you to quickly upgrade your versions, and it will console out through a linting process like deprecations. So one of the recent things that was added in was the content security policy alerts. So if you need to worry about cores or loading in things from another source, it will start giving you non-breaking notices saying it's going to be a requirement soon. You should start integrating it. So just getting like little hints about that is really, really nice.
So this is a lot more happy path than like AppKit, which was experimental.
Yeah, AppKit led to this. Everything we learned about it has made its way into Ember.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any judgment about AppKit, but AppKit seems a lot more like we're just trying this out, whereas this is more.
Seems about right. Yeah, this is what it's going to be going forward.
Is the dependency on Bower, is that like deep, or is it pretty cosmetic? Like, could you just throw that away in Browserify and it wouldn't be bad, or is it pretty like?
You might be able to answer this better than me.
Yeah, because we're standardizing the ES6 modules as our module format.
So it probably doesn't matter really.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't even know how you would go about the process for getting browserify into ES6 modules role seems like very.
So what are you using to do the module?
The ES6 module transpiler.
You are?
Yeah.
So you can use that already.
Yeah. So you could. Anyway, all this stuff goes. All this sort of like module lookup stuff goes through a class called a resolver. So if you don't want to, if you want to be in a browserify world, you can use something like Matchneer.js, write a resolver that works with the particular file structure alignment and browserify. Then you can use require statements instead. But I think you'll find.
But with the resolver, is that only Ember specific things, or is that how you would load every?
That's just Ember specific.
Okay, but like some random library that happens to have ES6, like you could just use that with ES6 invoices.
That will be this. That will be the future. So we actually have like I have a meta project going on. Once that, we're waiting on the transpiler to kind of finish it one go. After that, I have sort of a meta project to go around to what I consider foundational browser libraries, or accounting.js, whatever, and basically give them access to a command line, a node-based command line thing where it's like, please just author ES6 and then transpile to globals and AMDs. You can publish to Bower, transpile to CommonJS. You can publish to NPM for browserify. But really, ES6 module format is essentially a like syntactic subset of CommonJS, where you will not fuck yourself. So CommonJS, you can do sort of things like if variable is foo, require this, else require that. So you lose the ability to statically analyze your internal dependencies. So literally, you can't use browserify if your apps do this.
You're talking about expressions and statements.
Yes,
right?
and they're very adamant. Like, no, don't write this. Unfortunately, many NPM packages are written like this, and so the implicit syntax or the explicit syntax of ES6 modules is essentially a subset of the CommonJS format.
Right.
Different syntax, because it hopefully at one point will use generators, so it will appear synchronous but actually asynchronous. But that subset can transpile to CommonJS pretty well. There are some circular dependency problems. Anyway, so the meta project will be going around and getting people who author sort of web libraries to use this as the authoring platform, and then AMD, globals, and CommonJS as publishing platforms. So like we're using ES6 and Ember CLI, but obviously the browsers can't do anything in ES6. So right now we're actually transpiling to AMD because you end up with AMD modules. Which I think is also what browserify does, doesn't it? Transpile down to. So
no, it just
it just concatenates
closures and a map, so it keeps track of what it's already.
So actually, I think one of the best features about not just Ember CLI but ES6 module format is because you can essentially statically analyze it. There's this notion of tree shaking. So like, yes, if I require a thing and it requires a thing. So at some point, you will write your app. You will require parts of Ember and parts of Moment and parts of jQuery. The compilation process will figure out what parts of those libraries you don't use, and it will not. Which is something CommonJS and browserify will not easily get you because of expression.
Is Ember CLI going to have like a kind of bundler-esque sort of like find the single compatible version of jQuery amongst these? Or?
No, because that's really a package manager's job.
Right.
So Bower, we're talking with the NPM people because right now they're not the way NPM. This is probably review for most people. The way NPM does dependencies, if a library requires something, you require something, you each have your own internal dependencies, and never the two shall meet, so you don't end up with conflicts. Which is cool when you don't work in an environment that has pretty bad constraints around total ship file size, right? So in NPM, you're probably shipping to a modern server, and so like, oh, whatever, 60 megabytes of JavaScript, no big deal. For the browser, that's obviously crazy town. And so Bower it actually notices these constraints. It'll say like, hey, developer, all these things are requiring jQuery and jQuery like 1.7, 1.8, 1.9, and 2, and 2.1. Which one do you want me to give you? And so it's up to the developer to essentially decide what version they have. We're trying to get NPM to understand that is a constraint in the browser if they want to become like the package manager for JavaScript everywhere always. They weirdly do not seem convinced. So right now, no, Ember CLI doesn't do that. That's why we use Bower basically. So the way it's a little weird to have like two package managers, but the way hopefully it should work is currently Bower will be for runtime dependencies, and npm will be for build time dependencies. So like you'd pull in underscore if you use it in your Ember app. You would pull in through Bower. You pull in underscore through npm if you use it as part of your build script. So it's really actually like you put this in front of the average developer and they see hundreds of thousands of JavaScript files and don't know which parts and which parts don't. And if you have great ideas for how to make that more clear to people, I'd love to hear it because it's very confusing. I don't know anything about it. Yeah. I mean, yeah, me too.
I love that they exist.
That's an incredibly long-winded answer to what I don't even remember was the question. So.
No, that hit on all the like stuff though. It's like my flow has less tooling, and therefore less code generation capabilities, which sometimes is annoying. Also, less structural decisions made up front, which is again sometimes annoying. But it just uses like npm for everything, and that only has limitations in very rare cases, like Ember, which has this ES6 mod, which is admittedly progressive and probably good, but from my point of view, it's like if something is not npm, my odds of using it are almost zero.
Yeah, no, I feel you because like the browser by workflow, I have run into painful problems with it. But like it's satisfying, right? Like, good enough. And this is like literally a thing I don't want to be wasting my time with, and so it works. That world is probably ending. So we've had ES6 adopted for like 10 months now. Well, this process started
including EAK.
Yeah,
not more than a year.
About a year. Yeah. Angular and React both. Have said this will ES6 module format and probably ES6 classic text will be the way they're moving forward in there. So React 1.0 and Angular 2.0. So for browser JavaScript, like unless you want to go back to using Backbone, probably ES6 style is the way it's going to be. The hard task the framework authors all have to sort of collaborate on is like, okay, well, how do we bring package managers into this in a way that is as painless as CommonJS and npm is, because Bower is honestly pretty bad. It solves very, very common cases pretty well, even the tiniest amount of complexity, and it will just shit itself, which is a frustrating thing. And have we tried to like talk to them about? I feel like Yehuda and Tom have. And,
I think they have. I don't remember the latest.
Is Bower like a thing? Do people maintain
Oh
Bower?
yeah. No, it's very.
I always thought Bower was like dead.
No, very, very.
It's updated like every week.
What's that?
I said it gets updated like every week.
Does it really?
It is very, very active.
It seemed like it was like in the doldrums for a long time, but I guess people used it apparently.
Yeah.
I'm surprised.
People use it. It's very popular. It's unfortunately not really gotten any additional features. Like I think in their mind it's feature complete. In my mind, there needs to be way more convention around how it's used, how you expose multiple module formats, like what the main entry means. Like like part of why npm and CommonJS work so well is the Node community basically just said like, listen, we're using CommonJS as a format. If you'd like to use some other format, go fuck yourself. Main is the entry point for a library, and so if you have it available in your project, you can say require libname, and it will look for libname package.js main entry, and it will load that file through loader. And if you like something else, do that. This is the way it's going to be. And Bower is basically just it's like kernel.
They just configure it.
Yeah, it's just kernel.
But I mean, Bower has a harder problem because it's polymorphic file types. Some
Yes. Yeah, and they did not seem willing to take a stand and be like. So there are other browser library-based things like Component or Duo, which is the new one, which are aimed at browser libraries as opposed to server JavaScript libraries, and they have standardized in CommonJS as a module format. And basically, just said this is the format we're going to use. Don't publish things to this that don't use this format. Power they didn't want to take that stand. Because they could have taken the stand of like, use AMD. If you're not going to publish to AMD, like, they'll probably put it into our repository. But they just never did, so you end up with like a mix of globals, AMD. It's bad news.
Yeah, I hope everybody goes ES6 for the record. I would like to throw out BrowserFi eventually, but
Node literally has no desire to move away from Common.js.
Hey, real quick, Trek, do you want to make the announcement about the post?
Oh, I see. Alex is saying I'm boring everyone.
Yeah, you're really
yes,
awful. This is horrible.
Let's continue. Were there other questions for not me? But
There's one more slide that says thanks.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. If you would like to hear me continue to rant about things like package managers, boy, do I have a treat for you. You don't even need to put a single beer in me, and I will actually do it. There's a fine bar where the first Groupon ever was run. They're a pizza deal. They still have that pizza, that actual pizza, sitting in the back. The motel bar on the first floor of this building, so you go out and then just to the right, like 312 feet. And then back inside, and they have fine alcoholic and non-alcoholic libations and food. So we'll be retiring there. So if you'd like to continue these discussions or just give Alex a hug for making the router, we will be there shortly. Thank you all for coming.
did you want to say anything, like, even Cliff's Notesy about the thing that you just released today, though? Like,
Did we say anything about 2.0?
Yeah, you didn't say
I did.
anything.
I did.
Oh, you did?
Yep.
Well, like, what's...
Oh, the Cliff's Notes.
Give us some highlights here. For those of us who are very lazy users.
You're absorbing. So I guess probably the thematic narrative for Ember 2.0 is we looked around and pulled in features that we have found other people say are very, very useful and that we're investigating found to be very useful in other things. So for example, the router will likely become a service, so we'll have like services as a first class object. And that's kind of from Angular. We've decided that unidirectional data flowing and non-mutation from React is like most Ember apps end up being with unidirectional data flow and an action bubbling up. It's very easy to not know that's how you should be writing and use two-way bindings as like a lazy man's communication channel, which can really pwn coworkers if you like, oh, it's totally fine to just change it here, not realizing like elsewhere in the application they're relying on that not changing all of a sudden. So we'll be having a unidirectional data flow. Handlebars is getting a block syntax, which will allow for sort of easier composing of components. Probably the biggest change, the one that I like really lobbied for, I think Alex did too, was explicit data passing. So the route will no longer have a controller and a template. It'll have a component and a template. And the model will be passed explicitly into that top-level component. And it's that component's job to send smaller and smaller parts of that out to its child components, including actions, passing actions down, and those will just be functions, basically. You can think of just. I love all of that. I know. CK's so happy because I feel like we've had this discussion back and forth for a good year now, probably.
Because you're right, that idiomatically that is basically what you should have been doing, but it was less clear that that was the case.
For sure. Anyway, I could go on at length about this as well. If you have any doubts to how long I can go on talking about things, ask Sean, who will tell you. I will talk about things forever and ever anyway. But let's continue this discussion downstairs at the motel bar. I'll see many of you then.